They weren't afraid of death. Not really. Not the way we are. Death was everywhere. Hanging on the breath of winter, hiding in a shallow wound, dancing in the fields of war. But what they feared, what truly haunted the people of the Middle Ages, was what came after. A wrong move in life could mean torment in the next. And it wasn't just about sin. It was about curses, demons, night creatures that crept into your bed, and diseases with no names, only smells. Every creak in the dark might be something reaching from beyond. You could lock your door, but not your soul. That's where the real terror lived. They say the Middle Ages were dark, but darkness doesn't terrify you unless you believe something's inside it. And medieval minds were full of horrors. Ancient, intimate, and relentless. Imagine waking up to find the bread in your kitchen moldy overnight, the livestock dead without a wound, and the baby coughing as if choked by invisible hands. These weren't bad luck. These were omens, warnings. Maybe the village which cursed you. Maybe a demon climbed into your home through the smoke vent. Or maybe, just maybe, God had turned his face away. You didn't have to be a heretic to fear divine punishment. Even the righteous felt the sharp teeth of judgment. The church didn't merely preach love. It taught fire. Eternal, licking fire that consumed your soul forever. And people believed with a conviction deeper than blood. Hell wasn't abstract. It was painted on church walls, where devils peeled flesh from screaming sinners as children watched. It was written into plays, where actors screamed in agony as they fell into pits labeled damnation. It was whispered by dying relatives whose last words were often not peace, but terror. And then came the plague. If you want to understand fear, real fear, watch A World Rot in Days. Black boils under the skin, blood oozing from places no blood should come from. A man healthy in the morning could be dead by nightfall. And worse than the death was the not knowing. No one understood it. Some thought it was the Jews poisoning wells. Some thought it was God's fury. Others blamed the air itself, thick with bad humors. People fled cities only to carry the death with them. Dogs wandered streets filled with corpses. Whole towns vanished not just from the maps, but from memory. They say survivors walked with blank eyes, as if even fear had left them. But fear was never gone. It simply took new shapes. They feared women. Not openly, not in the way they feared bandits or wolves. This fear was colder, coiled deep. A woman who knew herbs was dangerous. A woman who gave birth without a midwife, who didn't cry at funerals, who looked a priest in the eye, dangerous. Witchcraft wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and the church said so. In small villages, it took only a whisper for an old woman to burn. Her bones were believed to curse the soil. Her ashes were scattered with prayers to keep demons away. They feared the forest, too. Not the trees, but what might live between them. Spirits that could steal your name. Wolves that were men by moonlight. Travelers who strayed too far from the path vanished. And if they returned, they came back different. Pale, quiet, touched by something unspeakable. Children were told stories not to entertain, but to warn. Don't follow the music you hear in the woods. Don't look behind you if you feel breath on your neck. Don't eat food offered by strangers with perfect smiles. But not all fears came from the unseen. Some wore crowns. A lord could ruin you with a nod. Serfs who displeased their masters vanished into dungeons or were hung in the square. Justice bent to power. A knight's sword wasn't just for battle. It was for silencing peasants. And kings? Kings had God's authority, or so they claimed. To speak ill of the crown was to invite execution. People feared rulers not for their violence alone, but because they were believed to be chosen by heaven. If a king was cruel, maybe heaven itself was cruel. And that thought was worse than any demon. There was a time when children feared the sky, not for storms, but for angels. Not the gentle, harp-playing kind we imagine today. Medieval angels were messengers of wrath. Blazing beings with many eyes, wings of fire, voices like thunder. When comets appeared or eclipses swallowed the sun, villagers fell to their knees, convinced the end was upon them. Even priests trembled. Nature itself could be a weapon, and no one knew when it would strike. Earthquakes weren't geology, they were God's fists. Lightning was a reminder. You are nothing. Even time was frightening. The medieval clock didn't tick. Told. Church bells marked hours not with numbers, but with calls to prayer, to fear, to confession. Midnight wasn't just late. It was the devil's hour. Dreams weren't dismissed. They were omens. If you dreamed of a black dog, someone would die. If your teeth fell out in sleep, you were cursed. People tracked lunar cycles and consulted almanacs, desperately trying to outguess fate. They feared the body, too, their own bodies. Disease wasn't a medical condition. It was a moral one. A wound that festered was seen as a sign of sin. A hunchback was cursed. A woman bleeding outside of childbirth was unnatural. The leper, the epileptic, the insane, these were marked by something dark. People avoided them, spit at them, prayed against them. Pilgrims wore badges and walked barefoot to holy relics, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a saint's bone or the cloth of a martyr could cleanse them. There was no safety in solitude either. You might think isolation meant peace. Didn't. Alone with your thoughts, you were vulnerable to demons. Monks wrote of temptations that clawed into their minds in the silence of night. Voices that urged them to leap from towers. Shadows that crept under cell doors. Possession wasn't rare. It was feared like wildfire. And when a woman screamed in tongues or thrashed in the streets, it wasn't madness. It was the devil inside her. And what could be done? The church held the answer: exorcism. A violent, desperate ritual where pain was weaponized against evil. Holy water, scripture, screaming priests, physical restraint. And always the risk that it wouldn't work. Or worse, that it would, but the demon would find someone else. There was no firewall between faith and fear. Even relics could bring terror. A vial of a saint's blood might weep on its own. A statue of Mary might bleed from the eyes. Was it a miracle, or was it a warning? People didn't question. They prayed harder. They fasted. They beat their backs with cords, marched in processions, cried for mercy in the streets. And yet the skies remained gray, and the rains didn't come, and the locusts still swarmed. And so, they feared sin most of all, not because it was rare, but because it was everywhere. In thoughts, in dreams, in hunger and lust and envy. A single unconfessed sin could damn you forever. That weight was unbearable. People lived with it like a second skin. So no, they weren't afraid of death. They were afraid of being forgotten by God. Afraid of living in a world where every shadow whispered of judgment. Afraid that the next scream in the night would be their own. And afraid that no one would hear it. Some fears crept in silently, wearing the face of love, loyalty, or even celebration. The medieval wedding, for example, was not just a joyful union. It was also a fragile truce between families, bound by uneasy trust and veiled threats. A bride might carry herbs not for perfume, but to ward off spirits. A groom might look over his shoulder as he recited his vows, wary of jealous rivals or offended gods. And if something went wrong, if a child was born too soon, or crops failed after the wedding, rumors of witchcraft would hiss through the village like wind through broken shutters. Even childbirth, the most sacred and hopeful event, was soaked in dread. A woman in labor wasn't simply delivering life. She was walking a thin line between worlds. Death hovered beside the midwife, waiting. There were no sterile instruments, no safe rooms, just blood, pain, and prayer. Sometimes the baby came out blue. Sometimes it didn't cry. Sometimes the mother bled and bled. And the priest was summoned not to bless, but to absolve. In these moments, the room grew cold with fear, as if some invisible hand had passed over it. And when a baby did survive, its danger was only beginning. Medieval people feared that infants could be stolen by fairies, replaced with changelings. These were not playful superstitions. If a child grew sickly or screamed too much, or if its features seemed odd, the mother might be accused of failing to protect it. Worse, she might believe the baby wasn't hers anymore. And so, some children were left near fire or struck with iron in desperate attempts to drive the fairy out. These weren't acts of cruelty. They were acts of fear, twisted by centuries of myth and suffering. In the quiet hours, even laughter could be dangerous. Medieval festivals, though filled with music and feasting, were never free from anxiety. Underneath the dancing and drinking lay the fear of chaos, of the world slipping into madness. During the Feast of Fools or Carnival, peasants dressed as bishops, fools crowned as kings. It was all pretend, but only just. The line between order and anarchy thinned. And if someone took the joke too far, punishment came swiftly. Laughter could quickly turn into a noose. Because what people feared was not just evil, it was disorder. Anything that threatened the fragile balance of their world was terrifying. And no place reminded them of that more than the battlefield. Warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't glorious. It was smoke, screams, blood-soaked mud, and broken teeth. And worse, there was no certainty of honor or meaning. You might die because your lord made a poor alliance, or because the enemy misunderstood your banner, or because you were simply in the way. Soldiers feared not just death, but mutilation, infection, captivity, and the unknown things left behind on fields where thousands died. Some swore they saw ghosts rise with the morning fog. Some believed demons danced among the dead, feeding on the souls of the unburied. But the battlefield wasn't the only place haunted. Homes, too, became traps of unease. Families feared curses. A broken will might be misfortune or a hex. A miscarriage might be natural or vengeance. People buried charms beneath thresholds, carved symbols into doors, were amulets made from teeth or iron or splinters of bone. Everything was a defense. Against what? They weren't always sure. The evil eye, a jealous neighbor, a forgotten promise broken. In a world without certainty, paranoia wasn't madness, it was survival. Even food was a source of fear, not for gluttony but for what it might carry. A loaf of bread with red blotches might signal ergot poisoning, a disease that caused convulsions, hallucinations, madness. Whole villages suffered, limbs blackened. People danced uncontrollably until they collapsed. Was it a punishment, a possession, or a curse from God? They didn't know, and so every bite was taken with a prayer, every drink of well water with a glance toward heaven. And the night, always the night, when the sun vanished, the world changed. Candles flickered nervously, doors were barred, saints were prayed to. You didn't walk alone. Night was the domain of the restless dead, of witches in flight, of beasts no one had ever seen but everyone feared. A child waking from a nightmare might be taken seriously, because dreams weren't lies. They could be warnings, or visitations. Even music could be dangerous. Some said certain melodies could summon spirits, that fiddlers who played the wrong tune in the woods vanished, that songs, if played backward or with the wrong words, opened gates that should never be touched. Minstrels were loved and feared. They wandered freely, knew strange stories, heard voices in wind. They could sing a blessing or a curse, and sometimes people believed they weren't human at all. But perhaps the deepest fear was silence. Not the kind that comes when everyone is asleep. The other kind. The silence after the priest stops praying and nothing changes. When the fields don't grow. When the rain doesn't fall. When the sick child gets worse. That silence, the one that follows faith and mocks it, was unbearable. Because it hinted that maybe no one was listening. That God had turned away. Or worse, that he was never there. In this silence, people cracked. Some wandered into the forest, never to return. Some starved themselves, trying to purify their souls. Some turned to flagellation, whipping their own backs until blood baptized the ground. Others followed mad prophets, abandoned homes, walked barefoot toward imagined salvation. And some simply stopped speaking altogether, as if words had become meaningless. And into this silence came the Inquisition, born of fear, fed by fear, a fear that heresy, thoughts, doubts, private ideas, could unravel the fragile world. People were tortured not just for blasphemy, but for thinking differently. And the line was always shifting. One day you might be a faithful believer, the next a heretic. Confession was demanded not for the truth, but to feed the fire. And people confessed anything, everything, because the pain was too much. Bones broken, teeth shattered, sleep denied for days. And when the fire came, it was said to purify. But no one screamed for purification. They screamed because they were burning. They feared the words written down in books they couldn't read. Because knowledge was power, dangerous, sacred, hidden. Only monks and nobles had access to the mysteries. And those who dared translate the Bible into the common tongue were hunted. Words could shift worlds, and the wrong word in the wrong ear could damn you. So they feared not just what they knew, but what they didn't. What might be in those texts, what secrets the priests kept, what spells the alchemists whispered in cellars beneath stone towers. And so the mind itself became a battleground. Thoughts were policed by prayers, desires buried beneath fasts, curiosity suppressed. And yet, deep in the shadows, people still asked questions. What if there's no hell? What if the stars don't control fate? What if the church is wrong? These thoughts were dangerous, but they came unbidden, and with them came fear, not of the questions themselves, but of being caught asking. This is how they lived, torn between hope and horror, between the known and the unknowable, between what they believed and what they feared they might never understand. They didn't fear the dark because it was empty. They feared it because it wasn't. But what if the most terrifying part wasn't what lurked outside their homes, or beyond the veil of the woods, or in the invisible world of angels and demons? What if the real fear, the fear they couldn't speak of, was what lived inside each other? Because in the Middle Ages, betrayal wasn't just a personal wound. It was fatal. Neighbors smiled by day and whispered to priests by night. A single accusation could mean imprisonment, torture, or execution. No evidence was needed, only suspicion. And suspicion grew like rot in a closed room. If your cattle died, maybe it wasn't fate. Maybe your neighbor cursed them. If your child fell ill, maybe it wasn't disease. Maybe someone resented you. Fear made enemies of friends and strangers of kin. Guilt was collective. If your father sinned, it could damn you. If your village harbored a heretic, the whole town could suffer. The idea that individual responsibility ended with death was foreign to many medieval minds. Curses lingered through bloodlines. Honor and shame passed from parent to child like infection. The family name was either a shield or a target. And so people policed each other ruthlessly, not just to protect their own safety, but to prevent contagion of soul. One sinner could doom 100 innocents. But some of the most profound fears weren't about punishment or death. They were about transformation. The fear of becoming something inhuman, something damned, a beast, a vessel, a slave to invisible forces. Tales spread of people who vanished for days and returned with blank eyes, of villagers who woke up at night in strange places, covered in dirt, their mouths full of something they couldn't explain. Were they sleepwalking, possessed, or worse, had their souls been replaced? Shape-shifting legends weren't just entertainment. They were warnings. Men could become wolves. Women could become owls. Children could become hollow. One of the most disturbing beliefs was that of the revenant, the dead who returned, not as ghosts, but as physical bodies crawling from their graves to spread disease, madness, and death. These weren't poetic spirits. They were bloated, rotting corpses, hungry and restless. In some villages, bodies were exhumed and mutilated to prevent them from rising. Heads were cut off. Chests were staked. Some were burned. The line between folklore and ritual was paper thin, and fear blurred it further. People didn't do these things because they believed in fairy tales. They did them because they couldn't afford not to. The clergy often fueled these fears. Even as they preached salvation, they described a world brimming with evil. Priests spoke of women birthing monsters, of hidden cults that met in the woods, of beasts that lived in the sea and sang with human voices. The book of Revelation was not metaphor to them, it was a road map. Every eclipse, earthquake, or comet was interpreted as a sign of the coming apocalypse. Children were taught not to fear the end, but to expect it. Every hour might be the last, and if the world ended while you were in sin, your soul could never be saved. This constant pressure to be clean, to be holy, to be alert, drove people to madness. Pilgrims dragged themselves across countries on bloody knees to seek forgiveness. Some starved themselves. Others lived atop poles or in caves, trying to escape the temptations of flesh and thought. And yet, no matter how hard they tried, the fear never left, because the rules kept changing. One century, dancing in a circle might be harmless. The next, it might summon demons. One day, a relic might heal. The next, it might curse. They feared the devil, yes, but more than that, they feared not knowing where the devil hid. He was believed to be everywhere, in wine, in storms, in mirrors, in laughter. He wasn't just the tempter in red. He was subtle, patient, always shifting. A clever trickster, a beautiful stranger, a voice in a friend's mouth. And worse still, he could quote scripture. He could enter churches. Some even believed he could masquerade as a priest. You could never be sure if you were being guided or led astray. That uncertainty was a special kind of horror. Medieval people didn't fear magic as much as they feared bad magic. Not the kind that healed wounds or charmed lovers, but the kind that corrupted bodies, soured milk, shattered minds. And unlike modern stories, where the wizard is a hero or villain, in the Middle Ages, the magician was often both, revered and hated. People sought them in secret, begged for blessings, then turned on them when things went wrong. And things always went wrong eventually, because life was fragile, and fear needed a scapegoat. Sometimes that scapegoat was the foreigner. Fear of the unknown often became fear of the outsider. The different accent, the strange clothes, the unfamiliar prayer. Jews were blamed for plagues, poisoned wells, and child sacrifice. None of it true, all of it deadly. Whole communities were destroyed based on rumors. Muslims, too, were portrayed as demonic by those who had never seen one. Travelers from the East were said to carry dark magics. Leprosy was blamed on contact with foreigners. Even local minorities, like beggars, Romani, or lepers, were viewed with deep suspicion. Fear made monsters out of men. Yet not all fears were cosmic or collective. Some were heartbreakingly human. The fear of hunger, of a winter with no harvest, of watching your child wither to bone while the Lord's granary remained full. The fear of cold so bitter it cracked skin and broke teeth. The fear of childbirth not ending with a cry, but with silence. These fears were ancient and physical. They didn't need monsters. They were the monsters. And for most people, they were daily companions. And so people clung to rituals, prayers, signs, superstitions. They crossed themselves when they yawned, lest a demon enter their mouth. They threw salt over their shoulder. They avoided saying the name of the devil aloud. Some whispered charms before eating. Others never bathed on holy days. These actions weren't silly, they were armor. Small shields against the endless weight of dread. Because the truth was simple. The world was a terrifying place. And most people had no power over it at all. So they created meaning. They turned fear into tradition, into story, into song. They told tales of saints who defeated dragons, of angels who protected travelers, of brave men and women who faced evil and survived. These stories didn't erase fear. They gave it shape. and by giving it shape they made it bearable. But at night, when the fire burned low and the wind rattled the wooden shutters, the silence returned. And with it, the unspoken question: what if all our prayers aren't enough? What if the darkness doesn't listen? What if the monsters are real, and they're already inside the house? There was something uniquely terrifying about the familiar. A crooked smile from the village healer. A sermon that lingered too long on punishment. A door left slightly ajar in a home you thought was empty. In the Middle Ages, the line between ordinary life and creeping horror was razor thin. What was safe yesterday could kill you tomorrow. Fear wasn't always dramatic. It seeped in through the mundane, through bread gone sour, through a cough in a crowded room, through a dream that refused to be forgotten. Many medieval fears lived in the body. Aches weren't just physical, they were spiritual warnings. A boil on the skin might mean sin, or a witch's touch, or the onset of something far worse. And when plague came, when it bloomed black beneath the skin and turned breath to agony, no one could explain it. Was it miasma? God's wrath? The devil's hand? Entire cities were emptied in weeks. Carts rolled down cobbled streets collecting the dead like refuse. Dogs gnawed on corpses. Priests stopped giving last rites because there were too many. And worse, sometimes those who prayed the hardest died the fastest. That was the cruelest fear of all. The fear that righteousness offered no protection. And then came the flagellants. Men stripped to the waist, marching through towns, whipping themselves bloody. They screamed prayers, begged forgiveness, tore their backs open under the sky. They believed that if they took the suffering of the world onto themselves, maybe the sickness would stop. But it didn't, and so their rituals grew more frantic, more violent. Some towns welcomed them, others feared them, because behind their devotion lay a kind of madness, the kind that could turn on anyone. Sometimes they chose scapegoats, sometimes they burned books, sometimes they simply vanished, leaving nothing but blood and fear behind. No one trusted the air anymore. People held herbs to their noses, wore beaked masks filled with spices, shut themselves in rooms for weeks, and still they died. Children died. Priests died. Nobles died. And when enough had perished, those left behind weren't grateful. They were broken. Survivors whispered of the dead rising, not as ghosts but as cursed reminders. Graves were reopened, bodies mutilated, buried again with iron stakes and stones in their mouths, just in case. But plague wasn't the only illness that brought terror. There were invisible diseases that struck the mind. Saints' fire, they called it, ergot poisoning from tainted rye. People convulsed, screamed, hallucinated. Some believed their limbs were being eaten by invisible beasts. Others danced until their bones cracked, until they dropped dead in the streets. Villagers gathered to pray, but some thought the dancers were possessed. And when prayer failed, they turned to fire, to isolation, to blame. Fear has always needed a name, and sometimes that name was woman. Midwives were respected, but feared. They knew too much, how to ease pain, how to stop a bleeding, how to coax a child from a womb. And knowledge, especially in a woman, was dangerous. A woman with too much silence in her house? A woman with too many cats? A woman whose garden grew too well? People asked questions. They watched her. They whispered. And when a child died, or a man fell ill, or the weather turned, those whispers became accusations. Trials followed. Torture followed. Confessions, real or imagined, followed. Some confessed because the pain was unbearable. Others because they had begun to believe the lies. And some went to the fire cursing their accusers, their screams echoing off stone. Fear of witches didn't spring from fantasy. It sprang from desperation. People needed answers. Why were children stillborn? Why did cows stop giving milk? Why did husbands go mad in their sleep? Blaming a neighbor was easier than accepting that sometimes the world simply hurt without reason. Even kings were not immune. A monarch could rule for decades and still be overthrown by rumor. Poison was feared more than the sword. Every cup of wine might be a death sentence. Food tasters became essential. Shadows moved strangely in court halls. Spies whispered behind curtains. Queens were accused of sleeping with demons. Princes feared their brothers. Kings feared their heirs. Fear ruled as surely as law did. Castles weren't sanctuaries. They were prisons of paranoia. And outside the castles, fear took on different shapes. In the woods, the green shadows held secrets. Not just wolves or bandits, but things older, stranger. Spirits of the land. Guardians of forgotten shrines. The old gods, some said, still lingered in the roots of trees. People left offerings, bread, coins, blood, not because they believed, but because they were afraid not to. Fear lingered in the liminal places, in wells, crossroads, forest clearings. Places where the world thinned and something else might slip through. The church tried to stamp out these old beliefs, declared them pagan, declared them dangerous, but the people still whispered, still practiced. A cross on the wall, a charm in the pocket, a rosary in one hand, a bone talisman in the other. They believed in both. They were hedging their bets, because even the church was not always safe. Monasteries held relics, bones of saints, scraps of holy cloth, said to perform miracles. But what if those relics were fake? What if the prayers were hollow? What if the priests were corrupt? These were dangerous questions, and asking them could cost you your life. But some asked anyway, and when they were silenced, their absence became its own kind of warning. Even language could carry fear. Certain words weren't spoken aloud. Certain names weren't written. People used euphemisms. Called the devil the Black One, or the Nameless. Called the plague the Red Guest, or the Great Dying. To name something was to summon it. To acknowledge it was to risk its attention. So fear became a silence passed from mouth to mouth. And yet somehow life went on. Fields were plowed. Bells were rung. Children were born. Songs were sung. But beneath it all, the fear never left. It lived in lullabies sung to scare children into obedience. In church murals showing demons devouring sinners. In bedtime prayers begging for safety not just from evil, but from everything. Because in the medieval world, safety was never guaranteed. And that was the scariest truth of all. The people of the Middle Ages weren't weak. They were enduring. But endurance is not the absence of fear, it's survival in spite of it. And the stories they left behind are not just curiosities of a superstitious past. They are maps of the human mind under pressure. Blueprints of what people do when faced with a world they can't control. They prayed. They punished. They fled. They fought. They blamed. They hoped. And above all, they feared. Not just the monsters of imagination, but the quiet, creeping dread that maybe, just maybe, the monsters were right. There was a moment, after the bells stopped ringing and the fires burned low, when a hush fell over the village. A moment just before dawn, when even the bravest soul dared not breathe too loud, because that was when the world felt thin, when nightmares had not yet faded. And in those silent spaces, people feared not what they could see, but what they might become. In the Middle Ages, identity was fragile. To lose control of oneself wasn't just madness, it was possession. People believed that a soul could be stolen, corrupted, or displaced. That a wrong word, a wrong step, or a wrong look could invite something dark to enter. They feared becoming something other than human. Not just a beast or a demon, but an empty shell. That fear ran deeper than death. Because in death you were judged. But if you were possessed, if you became something unnatural, you were lost. Not just to yourself, but to God. The church recognized these cases. Priests kept records. Entire rituals were written for casting out spirits. And sometimes those rituals were more brutal than the possession itself. There were accounts of children restrained, old women beaten, men starved until the devil left their bones. But what if it wasn't the devil? What if it was grief, or illness, or fear itself? They didn't know. and that uncertainty made fear grow sharper. But there were worse things than demons. There was the fear of being forgotten. Legacy mattered in the Middle Ages. Your name, your lineage, your deeds, all of it was a kind of armor against oblivion. Because when your body rotted and your bones sank into the earth, what remained? Only memory. But memory could be twisted, lost, or stolen. A child born out of wedlock might be denied inheritance. A noble's bastard might be erased from the family tree. A woman accused of heresy might be cut out of history entirely. And so people clung to stories. They told them again and again, not for entertainment but as defense, as proof that they existed. And yet, even the best stories couldn't protect you from madness. The mind was a battleground. They feared it in others and in themselves. The woman who stood too long in the rain. The man who talked to shadows. The child who laughed at nothing. These were not quirks. They were signs, warnings. Madness wasn't pitted, it was feared, because it might be contagious, or divine, or demonic. People didn't know the cause, but they felt the weight of it. Some monasteries tried to help. Others simply locked the afflicted away. Chains were used, cages, isolation. The idea of healing was foreign, what mattered was control. Keep the mad out of sight. Keep the community safe. But safety came at a cost. And sometimes the most dangerous madness was the one you couldn't see. That was what truly haunted them. Not the screaming lunatic in the square, but the neighbor who smiled too much. The merchant who whispered to himself. The nobleman who seemed calm while the world burned. Because if madness wore a human face, how could you guard against it? Fear taught them to look twice at everything. The birth of a child was not a joyful moment, it was a gamble. Babies were born sickly, or with strange marks, or not breathing at all. And if they cried too late or not at all, some whispered that they had been taken. That fairies had stolen the real child and left behind a changeling. These changelings were blamed for everything: slow learning, strange behavior, odd appetites. Some were drowned, others beaten. Few survived. The horror wasn't in the tale, it was in the fact that people believed it enough to act. Because deep down, people feared their own blood. Feared that their children might not be theirs. Feared that something unnatural might live behind familiar eyes. That their legacy might be a curse. Even nature turned against them. A failed harvest wasn't just bad luck. It was a message. Crops withered. Skies cracked open with thunder. Rivers flooded or dried to dust. They read omens in everything. A deformed calf, a double-yolked egg, a crow perched on the roof. Signs, warnings, punishments, and they responded with rituals, fires, dances, sacrifices, anything to restore balance. Because the world felt like a scale always tipping. One wrong action, one sin, one careless word, and the whole village could suffer. Collective punishment was common. Entire towns excommunicated. Entire families condemned. And so people watched one another like hawks. Fear turned into surveillance, into betrayal, into cruelty. They feared famine. They feared disease. But most of all, they feared the unknown within their own walls. The child who stopped speaking. The well that tasted strange. The bread that didn't rise. All of it meant something. And if no answer came from heaven, they looked elsewhere. To old gods, to hedge witches, to desperate bargains whispered in the dark. Because silence was the loudest fear of all. When prayers went unanswered, people didn't stop praying. They prayed harder, louder, with more violence. They walked barefoot across frozen fields. They whipped themselves raw. They built shrines out of bones and wept into the dirt. Not out of faith, but out of terror. Terror that there was no one listening. That the silence meant something worse than punishment. That it meant abandonment. And in that void, monsters grew. Some were real. Wolves, rats, thieves. Others were imagined. But all of them had power because they explained the unexplainable. And anything was better than facing the truth. that sometimes there was no reason, no cause, just pain. And so the people of the Middle Ages wrapped themselves in layers of meaning. They painted stories on church walls. They wore relics around their necks. They sang hymns not just to praise, but to push back the dark. They lit candles against the endless night, believing that as long as the flame burned, they were safe. But flames go out, and when they did, the silence returned. The fears never truly died. They changed shape, moved beneath the skin, spoke in dreams, waited at thresholds. And even now, centuries later, in a world filled with science and light, those old fears still whisper, because deep down we still dread the same things. To be forgotten, to be possessed, to lose control, to be alone, to face the dark and find it staring back. They said the devil was clever, but what terrified people most was that he was familiar. He didn't always appear with horns and fire. Sometimes he looked like your brother, your priest, your reflection. In the Middle Ages, evil didn't need to be monstrous to be real. It only had to be hidden. And so the worst fear wasn't of what you could see, but of what you missed until it was too late. Every face in the village carried a possibility of betrayal, of blasphemy, of possession. And once doubt took root, it spread like fire through dry straw. The baker who stopped going to church, the widow who sang alone at night, the scribe who copied strange books too diligently. Suspicion clung to people like smoke. You didn't need proof, just enough whispers, enough unease, enough fear. And nothing was feared more than the devil's servants walking among men. Heretics. The word alone could end a life. To be accused of heresy meant that your soul was not only at risk, it was considered dangerous to others. You could be questioned, tortured, and burned not for what you did, but for what you believed. Worse still, what you were merely suspected of believing. The Inquisition didn't require you to act against the church. It only needed someone to say you had thought against it. And thoughts? They're impossible to prove or disprove. That was the horror. Imagine watching your neighbor taken away in the night for asking the wrong question. Imagine staying silent, even when you saw injustice, because you knew what happened to those who spoke out. Fear made people compliant, but it also made them dangerous, because sometimes the easiest way to protect yourself was to accuse someone else. Children turned on parents. Servants turned on masters. Friends turned on each other. All in the name of safety. And in the end, the flames rose anyway. But even heresy had competition, because there was a deeper, darker fear beneath it all, hell. Not just a place of punishment, but a place of endlessness. People didn't just fear pain. They feared eternity. They feared being forgotten by God, not just in life, but forever. The church described hell in excruciating detail. Fire, worms, screams, isolation, the gnashing of teeth. And the terrifying part? You didn't have to be evil to go there. You just had to be unworthy. A missed confession, a secret sin, a forbidden desire never spoken aloud. Hell wasn't reserved for the wicked. It waited for the careless. So fear became obsessive, ritualized. You prayed at the right hour. You lit candles. You avoided certain foods. You confessed every impure thought. Not because you believed you were holy, but because you knew you weren't. And even then, doubt lingered. Because what if the priest didn't absolve you fully? What if your penance wasn't enough? What if God had already turned his face away? That was the most unbearable terror. That all your suffering might mean nothing. Some sought comfort in relics, but relics came with their own dangers. A scrap of cloth said to be from a saint. A shard of bone labeled with holy names. Pilgrims traveled across countries to touch these items, believing they held power. Power to heal, to forgive, to protect. But not all relics were real. And the fear that you'd been tricked, that you'd prayed to something false, was almost worse than not praying at all. The church, despite its dominance, was not without contradiction. Some abbots grew rich. Some monks indulged. Some bishops traded forgiveness for coin. And the peasants watched. They saw. They knew. But they said nothing. Because even when you saw corruption, speaking it aloud felt like blasphemy. So fear wore a second skin. Silence. There were those who tried to escape all this, who left behind towns and churches and wandered into forests, mountains, deserts, hermits, anchorites, visionaries, people who believed that only through solitude could they find the truth. But even they were not free of fear. Demons, they said, followed them, in the caves, in the winds, in the stillness of prayer. They saw shapes, heard voices, wrote pages of frantic script about temptation and terror. They weren't running from people. They were running from themselves, and sometimes from something worse. Fear didn't need a name to exist. Take the wild hunt. Riders on spectral horses, sweeping through the sky on stormy nights. Some said they were the dead, others demons, others old pagan gods on a rampage. If you saw them, you'd be cursed. If you heard them, you'd lose someone you loved. So when thunder rolled across the hills and strange lights flickered above the trees, entire villages locked their doors and prayed until dawn. Or the black dog. It appeared on lonely roads, in churchyards, at crossroads, a massive, silent hound with burning eyes. If it looked at you, death would follow. No one knew where it came from. No one knew how to stop it. They just avoided the paths it walked. And when someone died unexpectedly, and someone else whispered, they saw the dog, no one argued, because fear explained what reason could not. And the more unexplainable the world felt, the more powerful fear became. Some of the most terrifying beliefs weren't about what was, but about what might be. Purgatory, not heaven, not hell, but something in between. A place of fire and waiting, a place where souls cried out for release, and the only way to help them was to pray, to pay, to remember. People feared dying with unfinished business, feared being forgotten by those left behind, feared being trapped in that liminal agony for centuries. So wills were written with obsessive detail, candles were paid for, masses scheduled, land given to churches in exchange for prayers. Not for peace but for escape. Because purgatory wasn't final. But it felt like forever. And for those who couldn't afford the prayers, well, they hoped someone would care enough to remember. That was the root of it all, wasn't it? Fear of being alone. In death. In judgment. In memory. Even executions, public, brutal, horrifying, were less about justice and more about theater. A man beheaded in the square reminded everyone else what happened when you stepped out of line. But what terrified people more than the blade was what came after. Did the soul escape? Or did it linger, stunned, confused, watching its own body bleed into the dirt? That question never left their minds. Because everyone knew someone who died too suddenly, who screamed at the end, who spoke of seeing angels, or demons, or something else. And those last words were recorded, repeated, turned into warnings. He saw fire. She begged for light. He laughed, and then stopped. In a world so full of endings, fear was the only constant. But somehow people endured. They planted seeds they weren't sure would grow. They sang songs whose meanings had long been forgotten. They carved runes into wood and kissed the feet of statues. They held hands during storms and lit candles in cellars and whispered prayers while their children slept. Because to be afraid was to be alive. To fear meant you still had something to lose. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. They feared the forest. Not just because it was dark or full of wolves, but because the forest was where the world lost its shape. Where boundaries dissolved. Where rules no longer applied. You could leave your village with the sun overhead and lose your way before dusk. Paths twisted. Landmarks vanished. And if you strayed too far, they said, you might never come back the same. The forest was the edge of the known world. And beyond it, things that did not belong in the world of God. They spoke of witches, women with herbs in their aprons and whispers on their tongues. Women who knew when to plant, how to ease a birth, how to draw poison from a wound. But knowledge was dangerous, especially in the hands of the wrong person. Especially when it came from nature instead of scripture. And when a child fell ill, or a cow dropped dead, or a storm arrived too fast, people didn't look to heaven for answers. They looked to the woman at the edge of town. The one with too many cats. The one who never married. The one who never blinked when you passed her in the road. And when fear reached a fever pitch, those women burned. Sometimes they were midwives, sometimes healers, often simply lonely, but the fire didn't care, and neither did the crowd. Witchcraft became the language of fear. It gave shape to the invisible, explained the sudden, and offered a simple solution. Find the witch, remove the curse, and all would be well. But the truth was, fear never really left. It simply moved to the next target. To the leper, there was no greater symbol of divine punishment than a diseased body. Leprosy was more than illness, it was exile made flesh. Skin that cracked and bled. Faces that lost their shape. Fingers that curled in on themselves. But worst of all was the slow unraveling of identity. A man might be born to a good family, live well, pray often, and still, one morning, find a pale patch on his arm that didn't feel pain. That didn't heal. That was how it started. And when it did, you were marked, forced to leave your home, given a bell to ring so others would know you were near, given clothes that set you apart, sometimes even branded. No touch, no comfort, no hope of return. Lepers were both feared and pitted. Feared because they carried rot, pitted because they had once been whole. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the silence, the isolation, the idea that even God had turned his face. Not everyone who looked whole was safe, either. There were others with invisible marks. The cursed, the haunted, the unlucky. A man who survived lightning might be seen as blessed or cursed. A woman who dreamed of fires might be accused of causing one. A child who sang to birds might be holy or unnatural. Context changed everything. Timing decided fate. You could be a miracle one week and a monster the next. Because people didn't fear the truth. They feared what they couldn't predict. A shadow that moved against the wind. A voice in the rafters. A dream that came true. Dreams were dangerous. People believed they were doors to another world. Not just symbols, but messages. A dream of falling could mean death. A dream of blood could mean betrayal. Some villages had dream interpreters. Others simply killed those whose dreams stirred too much fear. And while some fears were supernatural, others were heartbreakingly human. They feared hunger, not just the discomfort, but the unraveling of society that came with it. Famine meant more than empty bellies. It meant fathers stealing from their neighbors, mothers selling their children for bread, people digging in graves for meat. Fear made them do it. Fear of watching someone starve. Fear of becoming the one who starved. And the worse the hunger, the more brutal the choices. Some ate bark, grass, leather. Some turned on each other. There were records, too many records, and always the same story. The year the grain failed, the rivers froze, the animals died, and people turned wild. And yet, worse still was knowing it was coming and being unable to stop it. Weather was unpredictable, storage unreliable, and even if you planned well, others might come for what you had. A full granary was both a blessing and a target. So they built walls, not just around towns, but around trust. Because when survival is uncertain, generosity is the first thing to go. Even among the devout, priests preached charity. But when their own flock starved, sermons turned sharp. They blamed sins, accused scapegoats, pointed fingers at outsiders, and the people followed. Because fear demands someone to blame, Jews were often that target. Despite contributing to trade, medicine, scholarship, they were viewed with suspicion, accused of poisoning wells, spreading plagues, killing Christian children for rituals that never existed. Lies, all of them, but lies repeated often enough become fear, and fear becomes violence. Entire communities were wiped out, and after the blood dried, after the silence fell, people looked away, because what they feared most wasn't the stranger. It was the truth, that cruelty born from fear lives in everyone, and sometimes it hides in plain sight, like in marriage. It was supposed to be sacred, unbreakable, but for many it was a prison. A woman belonged to her husband, her body, her labor, her future. Abuse wasn't called abuse. It was called discipline. A woman who defied her husband risked more than scorn. She risked being cast out, alone, starving, unprotected, and still they stayed, because they feared the world without a name, without status, without protection, even protection that came with bruises. Fear teaches compromise. A mother may give up food so her children eat. A man may turn in his brother to save himself. A village may burn its own elder because crops failed. These are not fairy tales. They are echoes, real, repeated. The Middle Ages were full of light and hope, yes, but fear was always the shadow behind it. A flicker in the corner of every prayer, a tremor in every feast, a silence between every bell. It was the invisible currency of life, and no one was exempt, because no matter how pious, how strong, how noble, you could lose everything overnight. A fire, a cough, a scream in the dark. Fear ruled not by roaring, but by whispering, by waiting, by reminding you that control was always an illusion, and the forest, the hunger, the heresy, the devil, none of them were as terrifying as the realization that at any moment you could become the next story someone else tells in fear. They feared the night, not just because it was dark, but because it was alive. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the final candle was snuffed, a different world emerged. One ruled by silence, shadows, and sounds no one could name. The creak of timber, the cry of an unseen creature, the wind whispering secrets through a thatched roof. In the Middle Ages, night was not just a time of sleep. It was a time of testing, and no fear was greater than what came when no one was looking. Demons, not metaphors, not ideas, real physical beings, so the people believed, lurking in the corners of the world, waiting for your guard to slip. They didn't need an invitation. They only needed an opening, a crack in your faith, a weakness in your will, a word you shouldn't have spoken, a dream you shouldn't have dreamed. And once they found their way in, they didn't just haunt. They inhabited. Possession wasn't rare in medieval minds, it was expected. A soul could be taken, twisted, and turned into something unrecognizable. And worse, no one could tell at first. That was the real terror. You might wake up one morning, and your daughter's voice sounded just slightly wrong. Your neighbor no longer blinked. Your brother no longer slept. What do? Then, when someone you love looks back at you with eyes that aren't theirs anymore. Priests were called. Latin was shouted. Holy water was flung. But not all possessions were grand and cinematic. Some were quiet. A girl who suddenly stopped speaking. A boy who drew symbols in the dirt and refused to explain. A man who stared at the same wall for hours and laughed without reason. And deep down, even the most rational feared, what if the devil lived in someone close? Or worse, what if he lived in you? That fear was everywhere, even in sleep. Because dreams were not always private. People believed spirits could enter your mind while you rested, could tempt, curse, or mark you. Nightmares weren't just dismissed as bad thoughts. They were warnings. They were attacks. Some tied knots in their hair before bed to confuse demons. Others slept with knives under their pillows. Parents whispered prayers over their children as they drifted off, hoping it would be enough. But it wasn't just demons they feared at night. It was the dead. The belief that the veil between worlds grew thin after sunset was deeply ingrained. The dead didn't always stay buried. Some returned for revenge. Others simply forgot they were gone. There were tales of wandering spirits who knocked on doors, who watched from corners, who waited for someone to acknowledge them so they could enter. Graves were salted. Bodies were buried with stones in their mouths. Stakes were driven through hearts, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that they might rise. And if a corpse was found unrotted weeks after burial, that wasn't a miracle. It was a warning. These beliefs weren't fringe superstitions. They were mainstream. Clergy debated them. Villagers testified to them. And when fear took hold, logic bent. You didn't need to see something to believe it. You only needed to hear a story. And stories, especially the right stories, spread like fire. One tale told of a man who laughed during Massachusetts. He dropped dead days later. People said it wasn't illness. It was divine punishment. And the priest who buried him claimed he saw the man blink before the soil covered his face. Another spoke of a woman whose child died suddenly. She cried for days, then vanished. Months later, hunters claimed to see her feeding the baby deep in the woods, except the child had no eyes and the mother no tongue. True or not, these stories had power. They created caution. Curfews weren't just for order, they were for protection. You didn't go out after dark unless you had to. And if you did, you carried a charm. You stayed on the path. You didn't whistle. You didn't speak the names of the dead. Because to name something was to call it. And not all things should be called. Fear shaped behavior. It made people close windows in the heat of summer. It made them leave offerings at crossroads. It made them knock 3 times before entering a room. And when children asked why, they were told, because it's safer. No more explanation needed, because sometimes fear didn't come from monsters. It came from not knowing if monsters existed at all. There were creatures, too, spoken of in hushed tones. Not devils, but not animals either. Things with the heads of men and the feet of goats. Things with wings but no eyes. Things that copied your voice perfectly from the other side of a door. They weren't in every town, but every town had heard of them. They lived in swamps, in ruins, in wells too deep to measure. They waited, they listened, and they remembered. People said, "Don't go there," and that was enough. But what happens when fear fails to protect? When the unthinkable breaks through every charm and every prayer? Then came madness. Madness was feared like few other things, because it couldn't be stopped, couldn't be buried, and worst of all, it could happen to anyone. A respected merchant who one day began eating clay. A nun who screamed blasphemies in the night and tore her own skin. A child who forgot their own name and stared into nothing for hours. And every time, people whispered, was it illness? Or was it a curse? Because if it was a curse, it could spread. Entire convents reported mass possessions. Entire villages fell into silence or panic after one person changed. Some said it was mass hysteria. Others said it was the devil's work. But what people felt was clear. This could happen anywhere. Even here. Even now. So they isolated the mad. Locked them away. Prayed for them. Feared them. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were reminders. Reminders that the mind could betray you. That sanity was not fixed. That one wrong word, one bad dream, one moment of weakness, and everything could unravel. And once it did, no one could bring you back. The final terror was being lost to yourself. Not to wolves, not to war, not to death, but to a world inside your own head that no one else could see, that no one else could fight. And in that silence, in that helplessness, people saw the true face of fear. Because if you are not yourself, who are you? They feared silence. Not the kind that came with peace or sleep or prayer, but the thick, unnatural silence that settled over a village after something terrible had happened. A silence that clung to the air, heavy and expectant. The kind of silence where even the animals refused to make a sound. Where no wind stirred, and people spoke only in whispers, as if the air itself might be listening. That silence always meant the same thing. Something was wrong. And worse, it might not be over. People feared what they couldn't explain, but they feared even more what they could almost explain. When the signs were there, scratches on a doorframe, animals refusing to go near a certain house, milk that curdled too fast, a child waking every night at the same hour screaming, but no one could put it all together. The unknown was terrifying, but the almost known was maddening, because it hinted at something hiding just out of sight. That's why omens were taken so seriously. A crow circling a house, a spoon falling from the table, a candle that wouldn't stay lit. These weren't quirks. They were warnings, messages from a world that didn't speak in words. And ignoring them could cost you everything. So people watched. They watched the skies for strange colors. They watched animals for unusual behavior. They watched each other too closely, because fear didn't only come from the outside. Sometimes it lived next door. Sometimes it sat across the table. A friend who suddenly refused to look you in the eye. A neighbor who started digging at night. A brother who started whispering to himself only ever in Latin. These small cracks in the world made people uneasy. But unease wasn't enough. It needed to turn into certainty before anyone acted. And when it did, the consequences were swift. Accusation, isolation, sometimes worse. Because once fear reached its boiling point, it demanded sacrifice. Someone had to be blamed. One of the most feared concepts of the Middle Ages wasn't the devil or disease. It was the idea of a curse. Curses didn't follow logic. They didn't obey borders. They were silent, invisible, and often irreversible. A curse could pass from generation to generation. A family's crops always failed. Their firstborns always died. Their animals never gave milk. And people whispered, "They are cursed." It didn't matter if they were kind or devout. The curse was stronger than character. Curses weren't only passed through bloodlines. They could be spoken, given, bought, and they could be hidden in plain sight. A twisted ribbon, a charm buried beneath a threshold, a single drop of strange oil in a cooking pot. People feared strangers who offered gifts, travelers who lingered too long, even wandering monks who asked too many questions. Because if someone cursed you, how would you ever know? Until it was too late? Even names held power. To speak someone's full name aloud, especially at night, was dangerous. Names tied souls to bodies, and if the wrong thing heard your name, it might come for you. Children were sometimes given false names for their first year, just to confuse spirits. And then there were mirrors, rare but known. Some said they trapped souls. Others believed that if a dying person looked into a mirror, their spirit could become trapped inside it, forced to watch the living forever. So mirrors were often covered during illness, during childbirth, during death, just in case. Because fear wasn't always loud. It was careful, methodical, ritualistic. Everything had its proper order, and breaking that order brought risk. Bread must be broken in silence. The hearth fire must never be allowed to go out completely. You must never return to a house through a different door than the one you entered. These rules weren't arbitrary. They were defense mechanisms. Small ways to impose order on a world that constantly threatened to slip into chaos. But perhaps the most lingering fear of all was one no one dared say aloud. What if God had abandoned them? They lived in a world of plagues and war, failed harvests and rising seas, endless suffering and inexplicable loss. Every church preached that suffering was part of God's plan, that patience would be rewarded, that hardship meant purification. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, that wasn't enough. Sometimes, a mother burying her fifth child wondered what she had done wrong. Sometimes, a monk who had fasted for months and still felt nothing wondered if he was already damned. Sometimes, entire villages would be struck by disaster after disaster, and people would kneel in the mud and scream at the sky, asking why. And there was no answer, just more silence. just more fear. Because if God wasn't listening, if he had truly turned his face away, then what was left? That fear couldn't be named, couldn't be prayed away. It sat beneath everything else, like a heartbeat under the skin. The fear that none of it meant anything, that the rules didn't work, that good people suffered for no reason, and bad ones thrived, and there was no justice waiting on the other side of death. Just more darkness. That was the true terror. Not wolves or witches or war, but meaninglessness. And because that fear was too heavy to carry, people wrapped it in rituals. They buried it in chants and candles, in relics and processions, in fasting and flagellation. They needed to believe their suffering meant something, that it counted, that it bought them a place in paradise, or saved someone they loved, or at least spared them from something worse. Because otherwise it was all just pain. And pain without purpose? That's the kind of fear that hollows you out, that makes you turn against others, that makes you burn the healer, drown the stranger, strike your own child. Because something has to explain it. Something has to balance the scales. So they kept looking for signs, for clues, for something they missed. A comet, a malformed calf, a storm at the wrong time of year. Anything to make the world make sense again. But the world didn't always cooperate. And that's why they feared silence most of all. Because silence never gives answers, only questions. They feared endings. Not just the end of life, but the end of the world. To live in the Middle Ages was to live beneath the weight of looming apocalypse. Time itself was believed to be a fragile thing, teetering on the edge. And at any moment, the trumpets of revelation could sound. The sun would darken, the seas would boil, the graves would open, and the damned would be dragged screaming into the pit. This wasn't just myth, it was a countdown. Every famine, every plague, every war was a sign that the end was closer. People studied the book of Revelation not as poetry, but as prophecy. They looked for beasts with 10 horns, for red moons, for rivers turning to blood. And sometimes the world seemed all too ready to deliver exactly that. In the 14th century, the Black Death killed 1 out of every 3 people in Europe. To those who survived, it didn't feel like a disease. It felt like judgment. Cities emptied. Churches overflowed with corpses. Children died in their mothers' arms. Bodies lay in the streets because there was no one left to bury them. It was not just death, it was death out of order. Death without dignity, without meaning, without mercy. And many believed the world was ending. Because how could God allow such horror and not be signaling the final chapter? Flagellants whipped themselves bloody in the streets to atone for the world's sins. Pilgrimages were made to every holy relic. Some communities turned to purity, giving up wealth and pleasure. Others turned to violence, looking for someone to blame. Jews were massacred. Lepers were burned. Heretics were hunted down. When people are afraid the world is ending, they stop being rational. They start grasping for control. But even when the plague passed, the fear didn't. It simply transformed. Because if that wasn't the end, what would the real end look like? The sky splitting open, angels and demons fighting in the clouds, the dead rising, or would it be quieter? Would it start with just a few stars going out? A harvest that never comes? A year without spring? Would people even know they were living through the end until it was too late? That question haunted everyone. So they searched for protection, for divine favor, for holy objects, relics, splinters of the true cross, the bones of saints, vials of sacred blood, became prized beyond reason. Some churches claimed to possess the same relic. It didn't matter. Faith made it real. People believed touching a relic might save them, might heal them, might keep the darkness away just a little longer. But what if faith wasn't enough? That was the final fear, that you could do everything right. Pray, confess, repent, fast, kneel, sacrifice, and still be damned. That hell was waiting even for the righteous. because hell in the medieval imagination was not just a place. It was the default. Heaven had to be earned. Hell was always ready, always patient, and it wasn't just fire. It was deprivation. No light, no sound, no God, only absence, only eternity. People believed hell had levels, torments suited to each sin. Pride, gluttony, lust, greed, envy, wrath, sloth. They all had their punishments. Artists painted them in grotesque detail. Writers described them so vividly that readers swore they felt the flames on their skin, because fear was a tool and the church used it well. But the terror wasn't just eternal suffering. It was the idea that you might not even realize you were damned until it was too late. That you might die thinking you were saved, only to open your eyes and find fire. That fear-guided behavior, shaped confessions, made people suspicious of any joy, any pleasure, any ease. Because if life felt too good, maybe you were already on the wrong path. And so they lived in fear of punishment that might never come, or might come forever. They feared being forgotten, unmourned, unnamed, souls stuck in purgatory, calling out for prayers that would never be said. That's why the Mass for the dead mattered so much. Why candles were lit, why names were inscribed. To be remembered was to have hope. To be forgotten was the second death. Even the wealthy, even kings, even bishops trembled at this thought. Because in the end, everyone was equal before death. The crown did not matter. The sword did not matter. Only the soul. And no one truly knew what would happen to theirs. So they clung to rituals, to processions, to sacraments. They wept in confessions and whispered final words with trembling lips. They built chapels and donated to monasteries, not just for the living, but so that after death someone would still pray for them, still say their name, still light a candle, because even a tiny light could hold back the dark. That was the great truth behind all medieval fears. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of being alone in the dark forever, of suffering without meaning, of crying out and never being heard, of opening your eyes and realizing you were wrong, and that you would never be able to make it right. And so they feared everything that might lead them to that fate. Witches, demons, curses, plagues, silence, the dark, themselves. And yet somehow they lived, they married, they laughed, they sang. They built cathedrals that still stand today. They left behind books and art and prayers and songs. Proof that even in the shadow of terror, people still reached for light. Because fear was only one side of the story. The other was hope. A desperate, stubborn, shining hope that maybe, just maybe, the light would return. That morning would come. That the story wasn't over. Not yet. So they lit candles in the dark. And waited.